name is Huang Kun. I'm director of this center and co-chair of this conference. Welcome to Singapore, to our foreign delegates, and welcome to NUS and CDPL. This morning, we are going to enjoy one workshop, number one, by Professor Dan Bernstein. Dan is not a stranger to Singapore or to CDPL. He was our educator in residence last year in September 2010. He spent 5 weeks educating us about the intricacies of teaching and learning. And Dan is a professor of psychology at University of Kansas, and also the director for the Center for Teaching Excellence. He's graduated from Stanford and San Diego, UC San Diego, and right now, his most current to-be appointment is President-elect of the International Society for the Scholarship of Teaching and Learning. I've heard many things about bottom-up, top-down, even middle-out. This morning I'm going to hear about inside-out. So let's welcome him.
Thank you very much. It is a real pleasure for me to be in Singapore. And I look forward to our morning here. This is my guess at what we'll be doing. It will be workshoppy with interrupted periods of presentation. You'll share your ideas and experiences. The green sheets you have, some of you are already poring over that. I'll ask you to do some reading and then talk about it with someone near you. I will add at different points a framing narrative, may even engage in a little presentation of stuff. My hope is that the product for you will be specific ideas that you might actually do in some module or course you're teaching in the near future. That's the goal here, is for you to come away with real ideas on a doable scale. Roughly it'll be in 3 sections with a 10-minute break twice. I don't know about your attention span, but I need to get up and walk around. So we'll do that. We will share the heavy lifting, the intellectual work here. You'll do some where I'll be standing here kind of watching, and then I'll do some while you're sitting there watching. You will do more of that talking and writing early, and I'll do more of it later. It's spread a bit, but basically once you've worked a lot of stuff out, I'll try to make sense of it. And last, I just want to appreciate your confidence that I could somehow make 3 hours of your time worthwhile. I mean, that's a real vote of some hope. And if there's anything I can do while we're in the middle of this to make it more of a good experience for you, please say so. It is also intended as a colloquy, not a soliloquy, so at any moment when you have something to say or a question or an observation, please bring it forward. So as I say, that's sort of the ground rules. The first thing I want to do is have us, and here's a sort of a humanities kind of phrase, let's unpack the theme of the conference and ask ourselves, what do we mean by these students these days? Whether you call them Gen Y or millennials or whatever term is comfortable for you, I just call it our students. What do we know about them? And so you'll see at your desk you've got a couple little pieces of Post-it note. Here's what I want you to do is pair up, turn these chairs, move nicely, turn around in 2 or 3, and I want you to think through what do you know about our students? What are the salient characteristics of them? Things that strike you as important in how it is to teach with them, right? And after you've had this bit of a conversation, put together 2 or 3 key things in a word or 2, and I want you to write it on here big enough that when we put it on that board over there, everybody in the room can at least see it. All right? Because what we'll do is do this for a few minutes, we'll put all of them up on the board, and then we're going to sort it out and see what is it we think we know about this group that we're here to learn how to teach. So please, in pairs or 3s, if that's the right number. Okay, if I could ask you to start writing some things down now. Remember to write big and write dark so that I can post them on that board. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Okay, let's, you will certainly be thinking of more as you go along, and you know, at any given break point, feel free to slap it up there. But let's sort of sort these out and see what kind of things people have said. High expectations to gain qualifications. Selfish. Visual. Disengaged. Vocal, overloaded. Results-oriented. 2 people said that. They want to be spoon-fed. Limited life experience. Short attention span. Good on use of technology. Result-driven. Let's put already. What I want to suggest we need to do is cluster these to figure out what they have in common. Resourceful, not readers, bright. Their age is an important quality. Presumably most of them are young. I don't know if you've got a lot of returning students in their 40s. Comfortable with multimodal style of learning. So there are 2 ways we can sort these. Well, there are many ways we could sort them. That's what psychologists do, is sort stuff. But one way is by whether these are things that are specific to where you teach, whether they are generally found among people of our students' age, and then whether they are things that have always been true. There's an English expression, "'twas ever thus." It was always that way. So let's sort of think about these in those terms. Which of these things are things that you think of as quite particular to your context, your institution, your field of study? Are there any of them there that when you think of this you thought, oh, it's pretty much just my students, or these more general things? Anybody, something you wrote that you felt was like that? No takers on that quickly. Let's try the other construct. Are there any of these that were always this way? This is nothing new, but the students we have today are a lot like the students that I taught when I started teaching. Which of them do you think are sort of more traditionally present? Any of these, have students been bright for a long time? So let's say the things that have, how about reading? Have students always been avid readers and suddenly they're not? So we have this dimension here. This is call this the always side. And this is the more recent side. And we can kind of organize them within that. So people have stopped reading as much. How about practical, results-oriented? So, yeah. This is something that's true of students. True of young people, I would argue true of adults as well. We are a small little club, people who like ideas and sit around and talk about them. This is not the majority of people in any society I've been part of. Ethical and moral. Ethical and moral. That there is a, these are people who are bound and driven by ethical ideals. No thoughts either way. Motivated. So the amount of motivation, we'll say the motivation has changed. So motivation is something we need to think about. Disengaged, overloaded. That's always been the case. So overloaded over here. Resourceful. Oops. Resourceful. Sort of an interesting, resourceful about what? I think people have become very resourceful on technology, and somebody else said that. Where was that? Well, I'll just put it right here. Resourceful on technology. Limited life experience, short attention span. Always. I think short attention span is nothing new. I can report having slept through more than one lecture in college. Just hate to say that in public, but in fact it's true. And when I think now of the things I didn't know when I was 20, it's just frightening. Sense of humor mixed in with daily class. They're very good at remembering and recalling things. Rote learning, yes. Now, when I was here last year, I was struck by how faculty colleagues said students at NUS learn things quickly. They'll memorize anything, and they'll do it when you tell them. They won't have the slightest idea what it means, but they're very good at that. So that may be better now. Ethical and moral, I think some people think always. The role of age, young people are just different. They have different priorities. They look at the shorter time horizon. So you get the idea. These are the things that we need to be, as I'm going to ask you to make plans, think about these properties of students. How is what you are doing taking advantage either of the unique things that are part of their recent lives, high in technology, overloaded, very vocal, tech savvy, very visual learners, more than listening to something, and how many are perennial things? The other thing to remember is some of these are liabilities and some of them are assets. The faculty members I hang out with tend to think about today's students mostly in terms of liabilities. What's wrong with the students today is, and then you get a long list. We also want to think that some of these are real assets. The simplest way I can give, there's an example. Do you allow students to have computers open in your class? At least half of my colleagues at KU will make rules. You may not have a phone, a smart device, or a laptop open during my class. Why? Well, because they won't listen to me. And so then that gets you to the question, well, maybe you could have them learning things while they're in class using those devices. So that's one way. It's a liability if you want to talk and them to do nothing but listen and sleep. It's an asset if what you want is for them to engage themselves. So that's sort of the context we're in. We can save that as a guide as you think about your planning. Look over at that. The next thing I want you to do is to think about something, a particular, I use the American term course. In Singapore they're called modules. Think of a goal for a module that you teach. Because in each of the, I'll call them exercises I'll ask you to do, I want you to be very concrete. Not, yes, I will engage students. Of course you'll try to engage students. But I want you to think of a particular course, a particular topic within that course, and your goal for that topic. And so, and that would include things like, what should students know or do or understand? I like to think of what are the top 5 things I want to accomplish in a semester. I cover more than 5 things, but what are the 5 things that really matter? That if I ran into them 2 years later and wanted to talk to them, they'd still remember it. They'd still be able to do it. So pair up and explain to the person you're talking with one important goal in one particular module, right? Because that's what I want you to focus on in each of the subsequent bits of thinking. If an hour from now you've mined that for all it's worth and you want to switch to another goal, that's okay. This is not a strict rule, but I think it's better if we focus. So please talk to somebody next to you, explain one important goal, and be fairly specific about what the module is and how it is that students would demonstrate their understanding of that goal. That's Dan speak for what is the assignment you use to assess it. I prefer demonstrate understanding. It's a more active construction of the process. Please. Okay. Thank you. So I'm in the fortunate position, or not so fortunate position, of interrupting good conversations. There's a wonderful physics professor I like at the University of Colorado, a young guy named Steve Pollack. And when he has students doing this, at this moment he says, okay, stop learning and listen to me. So I will periodically have the unfortunate role of interrupting what is certainly a good conversation. Keep that in mind. And I'm now going to present some stuff about inductive teaching, and I'll explain what it is. And I'm going to reveal to you a course that I teach, a module, one topic within that course, and the way in which I try to make it engaged for my students who are very present-oriented. And then after I've gone through that, I will ask you to again partner with the person you're talking to and imagine how you would use that same approach in the one goal you were just talking about. So keep that context in mind. So we'll make this context specific. And the basic idea of what I've evolved in doing over the years is to begin with something that is already familiar to students. It was my experience as a student and certainly as a young teacher that I would begin with the broadest principles, the constructs, the big ideas, and I would lay those out for students, and then I would show them the research that supported those, including my own, and then if there was time I would show them how they could use those things. What I'm going to model for you is turning that upside down and starting with the examples and work toward the big ideas. It's not a complicated notion. So I ask, what everyday events are relevant to the big ideas I'm trying to get across? My goal of what is an understanding. And what ideas do the students have related to that? So I'm going to describe my work on one course goal, how I engage them, and then I'm going to ask you to approach your topic the same way. Some of my ideas for this came from a young history professor named Lendell Calder, who teaches at a middle tier 4-year college in the center part of the United States, right near the Mississippi River. And Lendell's an historian who teaches American history, a short period, World War II to the present, so only 50 years. And he has a lovely article that I could share the reference with. I think I've already given it to CDTL. Each week he has one topic. On Monday he provides some sort of visual introduction, a film, a set of posters from the politics of the period, something visual. Again, we think our students these days are visually oriented. They are drawn to something they see with their eyes as well as textual material. They do homework over the period before Wednesday's class, and they are given an artifact, a document, a photograph, something relevant to the period they're studying. And their job is to come to class on Wednesday having written about that. What does it mean? How do you make sense? Where does it fit into history? So in order, he asks them to behave like little historians. As you can imagine, these are beginning students. They've never had a history course before. It's pretty terrible. Okay? But it is their ticket to class. You cannot come to class unless you bring your little piece of history writing. And in class Wednesday, they do as yours. They sit down with somebody and they exchange them. And they read them. And they comment on them. And they talk about them. About what did you say here? Why did you say this? Why do you think this is meaningful? And they behave as very, very beginner, novice kind of thinking about this artifact, this object, as an historical document. Yes?
Just clarify something. Is it a community college?
No, this is a selective 4-year college.
Does that mean there's more time for teaching? That's the only question I'm asking because I appreciate what you're saying, but in some of the situations, particularly what I'm in, all the other things I do, if I try to do that, the time factor would be very difficult.
Well, if you ask Lendell and others who do this, it takes less time to do this than to prepare a lecture. I mean, for Monday, he has to come up with one visual cue. Obviously over a career, you see things that you think would be useful. For Wednesday, he has zero preparation. He just shows up in class, they bring their work, and then he wanders in class listening to the conversations, commenting, noting stuff. So from his point of view, this part is not high labor.
Are you talking about in-class time?
Yeah.
This particular class has 3 50-minute periods per week. That's all. And that's typical, about 45 class meetings in a term. So I'm sorry, in terms of his labor, he finds it's relatively labor light. On Friday, he gives a mini lecture. These students have been thinking about the topic, they have tried writing about it. He then unpacks that artifact as a short lecture. So he then does and models for them what he asks them to do to come to class on Monday. So by the time they hear him give a lecture, they are already not expert, but exposed to and deeply involved in the particular question he's lecturing on. It's not their first exposure. He doesn't start the week by giving the lecture and then have them go follow his model and do it. He turns it around. He has wonderful data showing if you look at those Wednesday assignments over the semester, the quality gets much, much bigger. He also has an interview at the end of the semester. This is not something that does take a lot of time. With every student, he videotapes it and codes that interview to see whether they're thinking like historians, their kind of higher level skills have improved. And he finds they do. So how do I use this? I teach a course, this module is called Conceptual Issues in Psychology, and one of the things I do is I start with a visual and auditory clue. People watch a video of Martin Luther King giving his most famous speech. I Have a Dream. It was one of the public pinnacles of the American Civil Rights Movement. Most students have studied about Martin Luther King. I find in a typical semester, 1 person out of 30 may have ever actually listened to the speech. They know it exists. So it's very interesting. Or I also have them in the topic of self-control. The first introduction they have is they watch a 6-minute television program. There's an American comedy news program called The Daily Show. And this smart-ass host interviews people and challenges them with questions. And even though it is a humor show, it is literally on a channel called Comedy Central. It is one of the most watched news programs in the United States, especially among people younger than 30. Right? So they watch a 6-minute interview between the author of this book and this humorist. Why do I do that? Because, well, in those 6 minutes, every one of the themes that I want to cover in the next topic in the course is mentioned. And their next assignment for the next class period is to read 3 chapters of his book. So they get into it by hearing a humorist interview the author, who responds. He's also very clever, the author. So it's a magnificent, exchange of 2 very smart people who like being funny, in which they introduce the key ideas. Then I ask them to read. They're eager to read this. That's not the usual experience I have with students when I give a reading assignment. So these audio or visual inquiry options start with application. I start with, the food stuff is about, well, what should you eat? Why should you not eat processed foods? Why should you eat fresh foods? Why should you eat vegetables and not, hamburgers that have 1,800 calories? These are applications of a high-order concept called self-control. And the stuff I read about self-control is all mathematical models and equations and discount functions and all the stuff psychologists and academics love. And if I start with that, they will, their eyes will roll back in their head. They'll leave the class. So the learning is situated in real events. This is my course sort of generally. These are the topics: free will and determinism, introspection. Are you able to know what you're actually thinking? Self-control, nature and nurture, many topics. I'm going to focus on free will and determinism as the one goal I want to talk about. And this is sort of a layout of the materials. These are all examples of when we see this play out in our everyday lives. So they read a chapter in a book about a cult. They are fundamentalist Mormons, if that's a meaningful concept to you, in the American West, where girls are married off to Uncle Rulo. They're often married to a man who was previously married to their own mother, though not their own father. 13-year-old girls are married to 50-year-old men. It's a weird, weird community. Right? So I asked them to read that. the first day of class, I have them read about a trial in which a man who was convicted of murder is suing his psychiatrist for having let him do the murder, and the jury awards the man $500,000. This is a novel about coming of age in a small college in the 1960s. This is a play on a film. They watch a film. And remember, this is an academic course in psychology, not literature, not political science. But these are all things where, in each of these cases, free will is an issue. So here's the guy who blames his therapist. He was found guilty, not guilty by reason of insanity. He was awarded $500,000 because the psychiatrist did not tell his parents to keep him on his medications enough. The psychiatrist retired. He stopped working and was still found negligent. So this is what it would look like. They can read the newspaper article online. I give them a set of questions. Do you think that he should be in jail rather than in a mental hospital? Under what conditions does our legal system conclude behavior should not be punished? Obviously, when it's not a free choice. What characteristics would you look for in behavior that you should sanction? When is behavior voluntary? So I'm getting them, sort of like Lendl does with the artifact, I'm getting them to use their naive, uninformed view of freedom and responsibility to talk about this. This is where we start, with what they already think about something that they think is interesting. Hey, this guy murdered somebody, and now he's getting $500,000. With the Martin Luther King material, I send them to a website that has all these materials, and then I just get them to think about, what does Martin Luther King mean by freedom? And I also use some artwork related to 4 kinds of freedom. Finally, toward the end, this is one of those things where I made this text dark blue yesterday, and the PowerPoint gods reverted to this unreadable white text. I've given up wanting to spend my whole life correcting the errors in programs. The last thing they read is a debate in a high-end professional journal called Science between 2 psychologists, Carl Rogers and B.F. Skinner, 2 of the most famous psychologists in the middle of the 20th century, who debated free will and determinism and choice. Instead of starting with this is the last thing they read. They first practice dealing with it on their own in a context they might care about. Students in college who are conforming to their fellow students. A murderer case. Young women being forced to marry older men and then doing it voluntarily and saying, yeah, I like this. I want to marry Uncle Rouleau. At the end, we get to the real psychology. So this is sort of the way it works, is we begin with the examples, and then you work toward a discussion of the theory and the analyses. And then it loops back because the tests I give are about examples, but examples they haven't seen before. So they do all this stuff that's very contextual. They finally get to the Skinner argument, and then I ask them, once they've understood that, can they use these ideas to analyze a particular case that's not one of the cases we already talked about? This is called Inductive Teaching. Not that the name matters. A rose by any other name would smell as sweet. There's a nice article by Michael Prince and Richard Felder. You begin with the specific, you use a lot of examples, and the theory or conceptual analysis emerges. It is not merely an afterthought. So it's your turn. What I want you to do now is talk to the person about your goal and ask yourself, how could I take that goal and introduce it to my students in a particular real-world part of their lives? Now, this is a challenge for some people because what you teach may not be relevant to everyday life, but is there a way you can do that? So please, discuss that. Okay, if we could reconvene, I'm going to, in the future, I've set my timer this time, so it will make that sound will warn you that I'm going to want to bring you back together again. So I'll remind you what that sound is like. We've given you a couple of pieces of paper like this, maybe only one, there are more. This is for you to be taking notes, writing ideas. If you thought of something that you particularly want to remember in that conversation you just had, write that down. At the end of the day, or the morning, I'm going to ask you to take one of your ideas from all of today's workshop and write it out in 2 or 3 sentences. See, that's the sound. That will mean we're going to stop soon. And then give it to me. I will also be keeping these. One of Huang Hun's idea, as you may, if you looked ahead in your program, you know I give a talk on Friday with the same title. And it will follow the same ideas, but I will include some of your work. So I'll display how we unpacked what these students are like and how we clustered them and share your ideas along with the ones that I'm going to have you read about. So the paper is to be taking notes, and then at the end I'll ask you to spend a few minutes and actually write out a short description of what you see of as your best, most interesting idea. It's also entirely likely that some of you are already doing this work and this is old hat to you. Been there, done that. We'll see. Okay, the next thing I want to have you do is read an example. Read it quickly. It's in the green pages, but it's not the first one. I was not careful in how I got this stapled. It's the one, it's in the middle. It's called Getting the Stuff Done in an Introductory Course by Sheda Jahanbani. So it's literally the complete middle. Take 5 or 6 minutes to read that. You're not reading to take a test on it. You're reading to get the idea. So read that quickly, and then we'll talk about how what you think she is doing matches the strengths and liabilities of our students as we describe them. And then the last thing we'll do with that is you'll say, how might I use something that she writes about in your own goal? So you've perhaps not finished completely, but let's think about anything you noticed in what she did that seems to be related toward the characteristics of students, things in which she made her course more student-centered and less Sheda and history-centered. What skills do they bring? What preferences do they have that she accommodated?
She used the wiki. Create some semblance of like a Wikipedia style thing. Yeah.
So that's a form of discourse that they already know. Couldn't hear you. Took away the exams. That the exam is sort of friendly to us. It's our native way of measuring, but not so familiar to them.
Yeah. She conformed to a learner-centered style of teaching.
Okay, and what were the learners doing in this case? What would she have them do at the front end of the course where she was trying to build the rapport with the students to get their buy-in to the module?
Meet their expectations, what the history was supposed to be about, so they had the history.
And highly structured. Students like book reports. I read the book, I tell you what was in it, I'm done. Okay, so their natural discourse is in Wikipedia and shared spaces like Facebook. She said, why don't you do a giant book report? Here are the books. Go find what's in them and organize the stuff in a wiki. They loved it.
Still like textbooks too, so they use primary sources to do exactly that.
Yes, and in some of her advanced courses, she uses more primary sources. She takes this model way up the food chain. So she met them where they were in terms of their preferences for the kind of conversations they thought they were going to have, the kind of task they're good at. She didn't say right away, okay, I want you to read 2 primary sources and synthesize it. Tell me what it means. That's what she hoped to accomplish at the end. She started them where they were, with a skill and a form of discourse that was native to them. Do a book report. Do it in a shared public space. Build it with your friends. very clever way to deal with the complaint. Now, did she cave in? Did she give in to their complaints from the first wave of self-evaluations? No. What did she do instead?
She thought that she was actually wanting to do what she had in here,
Right.
that it wasn't manifesting.
Right.
So she actually got what she wanted.
Yes, and she did so by going through their natural way of being, not doing it the way an historian would, by starting with historiography as the first 2 weeks of the class. So, for a few minutes, share with your colleague, is there some way that you could get your students on board, particularly early in a module, by having them engage in some construction of the stuff that you are wanting them to thoroughly digest, synthesize, and understand? You can start by just thinking, maybe writing down a few notes, but then talk with each other. Okay, if I can again be the interrupter. So there are many examples of this. Shada used a wiki on the CDTL website under the Technology and Pedagogy section. There's an example of someone who used Facebook for the same purpose, and you can find that there. You could use a blog. There are many technology tools to have students come together and create, when I do it in my class, I call it a repository. The students collectively gather the materials, and then they each individually write a paper based on those materials. So it's group research and preparation, individual synthesis. Many, many versions of this. And I hope you've gotten some notes there. It's time for our first break. We'll take 10 minutes. Well, I'll use that clock back there, so 10 minutes from whatever your watch says now. And the next thing we'll do in the middle section will be 3 more examples of ways to engage students. And in each case, we'll ask, how does it map into their assets? How does it avoid their liabilities? So, 10 minutes. Okay, thank you. So in this next section, you'll work through several different examples of ways in which people have either influenced an assignment to try to connect it to students' assets or an activity. In one case, one course tried to do both of those. The next example I'd like you to read, where did the device go? Is a professor who decided to focus on a sort of natural inclination of students to debate. Students are very vocal, and when you provide a context in which they are creating arguments that they make to each other, and this is the second one in the packet. It's called Athenian Reflections on Learning. And what she was interested in was students getting caught up in an issue, not necessarily because it was about themselves. I mean, the context was actually quite distant. Context was a role-playing game of debates about democracy in ancient Athens. That's pretty abstract. But what she did know, this was a course in rhetoric and public speaking, was that they really enjoy being in a role and trying to win an argument. That's part of the vocal, engaged part. So take a quick look. It's a little, it's about a half page longer than the last one, but again, read it for speed, not for, and then we can talk about whether this approach could be useful. And I'm going to ask a colleague in the back who, during the break, told me about students debating to share his experience, because I thought it was really, really interesting. So please have a read. Again, I'm sure you couldn't, perhaps haven't finished, but gotten the gist of it. particularly challenging module for this professor because she's asking people to deal with classical rhetorical style. It is a course that is required of every student for graduation, so it has that disadvantage as well. Do you think your students would find such a forum interesting as an activity? To be in a debate, either very formally structured debates around a particular narrative or just debates? Could I ask you to share your experience when you said the student debates just broke out in class?
I was discussing influences on education, and particularly in a school context, and we were covering the concept of family. And someone had brought up the observation that they may have gay couples that they would deal with in school, and they need to, And one of the students in the class was a very strong fundamental Christian, and he stood up and he said that, that he had nothing against gays personally, but gays were going to go to hell. And then proceeded to recite from a couple of, I think one was Leviticus and one was Romans from the Bible. And then almost to a person, everyone else in the class turned on him and started, yelling, and I had to hold it and say, hold on. Let's see what he has to say. So he formulated his argument about why gays go to hell, even though he thought he wasn't against it, the guy was supportive, but they still go to hell. And then I said to the class, okay, I want you to formulate an argument about why your ideas about not being a it's okay. And no one could. All they had was the big picture they had that it was wrong to discriminate, and they couldn't actually articulate a response to it in any way, which I found really interesting. He had a way of articulating what he thought, whether you agree with it or not, but the rest of the class could not articulate to him why what he was saying was wrong. All they could tell him was it wasn't wrong.
So there's a case where there was an intrinsic motivation among the students to engage the conflict, the intellectual disagreement that motivated them, and it made for a teaching opportunity. So take a moment and think for yourself. Are there natural disagreements in perspective, classical issues in your field, in your module, where you could capture students' engagement by having them disagree with each other, either in smaller groups or, as many faculty such as Chris did, in a sense in a plenary for the whole module, with the whole class listening to two people arguing or two groups of students arguing with each other. So please think about that for a few moments and share it with a colleague. And as always, if you get a good idea, write it down. Okay, there's a way of framing some of this conversation. So wonderful. I'd like to focus on a key point here about what the students were doing in this public expression. And it has to do with a concept that I mean, it's a standard word we all know, but my friends in composition studies talk a great deal about audience. When the students are writing a paper that they turn into us, the audience is obviously the professor. One of the things that's interesting about debate is sometimes the audience is the other students. It is a more public statement. And so you engage some of the same creative juices that students show when they write at great length, texting on their phone all day, writing on Facebook, reading and writing tweets. I had a wonderful meeting yesterday at UTown with David Brown, in which he talked about using genres like Facebook writing as a way of teaching writing. Because for the students, that is writing with an authentic audience. When you write a term paper that has to have the following structures and citation formats and all that, for a professor, yeah, you can do that. But it is not an intrinsic genre with a meaningful audience. Not that we're not meaningful, but we're not. So, and I have found that to be another kind of key guide as I imagine how do I be more, how do I speak to students based on their characteristics? I try to ask myself, what is their audience for their own natural writing? They spend a lot of time generating text. It doesn't happen to be text in the forms I use. And so another example I'd like you to focus on is by Professor Ayu Saraswati. These 4 examples, by the way, are from colleagues that I have known at the University of Kansas. I think hers is the last one in the packet. She unfortunately has left and gone to the University of Hawaii. She heard a presentation about digital storytelling, which is a sort of edubabble term meaning making videos. And anybody ever heard of something called YouTube? Apparently I go to YouTube about 100 times less often than anybody else I know. I go there when somebody sends me a link. It has become a ubiquitous form of articulation and expression. From family videos of here's the grandchild falling in the swimming pool to students concocting wild and crazy situations and enacting them to political and musical events. I mean, it's amazing the breadth of that. IU recognized that that is a form of articulation where the students would produce something that would have a natural audience other than, or at least in addition to, the professor. And so she, again, had academic goals. This wasn't, hey, let's hang out and talk, cool current stuff. This was a course in women and gender studies. She was interested in their using theory to understand the construction of gender in their own lives. But she organized the course not around a term paper, but around a video. Each student was to produce a video. So, and it turned out, with only very modest assistance from the instructional technology group, the students knew how to, they weren't good editors, but they certainly knew how to produce the raw video and to think it through. So, take a moment, read through her account, again with the idea of thinking, is this something that you could possibly find a way to include? And if not this particular form, thinking what are the natural forms of presentation that students use other than the academic term paper? Is this sort of thing wildly impossible to imagine doing? I mean, let's be concrete first and say, okay, IU suggested, every student's got a phone that'll take video. If they don't, they've got a camera that takes video, and half of them have a video camera. Is this something manageable, literally in this medium?
Yeah, but the thing is that it is very nice, but it's a bit challenging when you come from the science, right? Because we have a certain way of teaching our principles and all that. So, in quantum mechanics, for example, something like this might be difficult to fold in, although I see the value in it. It engages students.
Yeah, it would be a challenge to imagine what is the content of such a video that would be relevant to your intellectual goals. I'm going to talk about a physics example in a little bit in the third section that is pretty untraditional, not in this way, but in a way that teaches very unlike the usual and has very good outcomes. But it would be an interesting empirical question whether, so in quantum mechanics, could you imagine asking students to try to make a video that would explain to their parents the dual slit experiment. Or, I'm not really good in quantum mechanics, but there's something about if you've got two particles that are connected, they're apart from each other, the direction of the spin is connected. Okay, so someone didn't explain it to me very well. Could they, and in our writing circles, this is called translational writing. And I have a number of colleagues who do that in psychology. One colleague has an assignment where students are to read 3 professional journal articles. They are then to write an advice column for parents based on the research in those articles. So they have to do more than a book report. They have to synthesize it, figure out what does it mean altogether, how do they connect, and then put it in language that somebody who's not a psychology student would understand. Very, very challenging. Now, what she has found is, she's been working on this for several years, when she gets students to be able to do that, their understanding of the 3 articles is much deeper, because they have moved beyond just repeating what was said to some sort of integration and application. So, you know, it'd be nice to see if a student could convince his or her parents that quantum mechanics is real, not some crazy idea from some guy in Britain.
I was just wondering how this fits in with giving traditional lectures. Do you still envisage doing that, or is it just really independent student learners that they just go off and do this stuff? How does that work?
I think that's a wonderful question, and I think the range is enormous. There are people who are never giving a lecture, and every class period is stuff like this. And there are people who punctuate these experiences with lectures. I kind of like the Lendl-Calder model, where you have the students constructing things, engaging, and that prepares them so that when you're ready to give that synthesization, that, you know, okay, I've been doing this for 20 years, I understand this, here's what I think about these problems you've been working on. The lecture works really well. There's a great article called A Time for Telling that argues that lecture as first exposure is not very helpful. Students don't remember much if you just lecture facts at them. If the lecture is to an audience of people who already know the basics, it's a fabulous way to convey high-level thinking. The problem is we have our curriculum usually upside down. We lecture to the first people and we don't lecture to advanced graduate students. We figure, well, we should be in a conversation with them. So, and you know, the whole hybrid course debate. I mean, what's the right mixture of online material done outside and face-to-face interaction? I see places for all degrees. Right now I'm kind of leaning toward 50-50 on the hybrid myself, but that's my tastes. Yeah.
The thing of the video, actually I've seen it done in Australia. They are quite big on this, using new media to teach science. And I went to attend a workshop there, and I saw the lectures in science, in pharmacy and all that, and we were actually required to make a video using whatever props we had, you know, plasticine or whatever, and it just took me 1 hour. I'm not a science teacher, so I just did a very simple science thing, which I could remember was just the water cycle. It just took me 1 hour, and we used a technique called slowmation, and I could do this using the plasticine and demonstrate the whole thing about the water cycle and how, you know, condensation, evaporation, and all that. And I saw somebody else do one on carbon monoxide poisoning and trying to demonstrate what actually happens within you if you have carbon monoxide. It was very technical kind of thing, but it could be done with the proper storyboarding and everything within an hour. And so that's, I think they do a lot of that in Australia already, and I tried to do something similar in the course that I teach. The students actually were required to, it's a group work kind of project, and students were required to find a topic that they wanted to do on an environmental issue that they're concerned about. And the whole idea was that the audience would be fellow tertiary level students, and they had to explain the problem, have suggestions on what they could do about this environmental problem. So they went out and a lot of the students just did animation, and I didn't teach them a thing. I didn't teach them a thing about the technical aspects. They picked it up themselves. They knew how to find out how to do it. and they created a 3-minute video, which we told them to upload on YouTube. And basically, they have got an environmental message out there with an audience. But it is a part of business.
So that's an example of using the assets of the students who come to us. They may not be willing to sit and listen quietly for 50 minutes. They may not know how to write a 15-page paper using proper citation techniques for professional journals. But they're happy as a clam to try to make a 3-minute video, to take a complicated set of ideas and articulate it in a way that's concise and that has a meaningful audience.
I think I like the term that they were using actually when I was in Brisbane in this workshop. One of them said that they were making thinking visual, critical thinking. They were making it visual. So the students, in order to do that little piece, they had to keep going back to their textbooks, to their learning, in order to do something that is accurate. Yeah.
And that's one of the things I liked about IU's writing, is I sort of challenged her. I've not been a big fan of digital storytelling because I thought the first couple I saw produced by students didn't have much depth. So I kind of challenged her. I said, well, is there, if you view these through the same sort of rubric you would use for a term paper, are you finding the same quality of content? And that's a very challenging question, because it does mean you have to think about what was my goal in the old form of representation. And was that the right goal? If it was, am I seeing it in this as a medium that the students are comfortable with?
Online there's 60-second science, where they have many videos that you must be able to explain that science concept in 60 seconds in that video. And there are contests for the students also. So, they could, but in order to do that, they actually have to read and reread and reread their material very, very well, and they learn it very well.
I think that's the key to your question, is that it may not be a perfect representation, but it motivates them to do the reading. It gives them a reason to do all the reading and preparation to produce this, meaningful expression to their audience, but it would result in their understanding things that you want to measure on an exam. And it's actually please.
Oh, sorry, I was just thinking about making the lecture thing, because I was thinking about that. Teaching shaping, which is progressive reinforcement of behaviours you get behaviour. I get it's a lecture with 400 people in, and I send one student outside and I say, when they come back in, we're not allowed to tell them, but we want them, and I'll pick something. Like, one time I wanted to pick up a marker and just write something on the whiteboard, and that's what you get to do, and we play hot and cold. And everyone just goes cold, cold, to the student progressively gets to the spot, and they pick it up, and everyone's hot, 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 and they write something. And every year, it can be a different thing, whatever I think. And then we play a game, then we go back and I start to, well, what happened there? So you can do things even in big lectures to involve students, and they're doing something that it's a game, but it's not that you can then relate to the topic.
Can I just put a caution? I mean, I'm very excited and interested in all this, and I try a lot of innovative things as much as I can, but my technology ability is fairly limited. But I also assumed several years ago that the students' ability would be very much more advanced. And I found that was a bit of an assumption I had made too, because I gave a class to only a small group of 45 cultural diversity in the workplace, a choice to do a YouTube or an oral presentation of mental management to the company. Right. And 99.9% chose the presentation. Only one person took up the YouTube offer. When I sort of reflected and asked the students to tell me about it, they were saying that why would they do all that extra work when they can just simply stand up and do it. So I'm not sure yet how to get around that idea too.
I don't know that you have to. I mean, at some level, I think you made an extremely wise choice. You gave them the option. Let them tell you what their assets are. In the case of other cultural educational contexts, students rise very quickly to the idea of a video, and they don't like oral presentations. A lot of people take Chris Bruss's courses in oral communication only because they're required to. They hate it. They don't want to stand up and give a talk, whereas they love playing around with gadgets. I also agree with your first key point, which is the students are not nearly as tech savvy as the pundits would like to claim. I mean, there's all these people writing, oh, our students are digital natives. They like YouTube, they like Facebook. that doesn't make them skilled at digital technology. They're good users, but they're not necessarily skilled in producing. So you do have to scaffold that as well.
Can I also make one further statement? They're not also good at the academic contexts as well. Because I know there's a difference. I mean, in this one here, she's talking about honours students. So to me, by then, their idea of writing in itself in an academic setting and context is fairly, hopefully, fairly firm. But if we're talking first years, then some of them are still struggling very much with even the pundits of writing, the structure. So I think, again, you know, it may not work quite as well.
That's why I'm hoping that as you're making notes, you're thinking about your students, your institution, your module, your program. Who are those students? That's one of the things we always have to start with in backward design of any module, is who are your students, what do they bring to the table, what can you assume, and what not. And you know, for me, the thing we need to hold ourselves to is that the students are going to learn something in the end. The path that works for those students can be quite variable, and there's more than one path to good learning. So the last example I want you to look at is from a philosophy professor. We've talked through that. She was director of women's studies for a while. She's now an associate dean in the College of Arts and Sciences. And she was interested in teaching a course in feminist philosophy, which, you know, like all philosophy, and I don't mean this in a terrible way, can be kind of dry. I mean, it's about ideas, it's about logical thinking, it's about the development of structures of intellectual argument. She wanted the students to care about feminist philosophy, and so she had them. She came to a service learning, we call it, institute in our center, and was introduced to the idea of community engagement. Sometimes people think that is, well, we're going to go save the community, but the average undergraduate doesn't have skills other than his or her labor that could be helpful. So it's less that they're going to transform somebody with their brilliance, and more that it transforms them and motivates them to do the work in a course. So this is another, I think, nice example where the activity was service in the community. The benefit, the assignment, was to document what the students observed and how they connected it to the course. And she had them use web presentations. Again, not a term paper, but in a form that is of things that they read all the time. And so if you read her reflection, I'll show you some slides from the student work after you've read it, but this is her thinking about, well, why did she do it and how did it help her? But it was meeting the students with something that she thought they would be instantly interested in, a battered women's shelter, a daycare center, a community cultural center, and how that connected them to the abstractions of feminist philosophy. So please, this is the front one, finally. The last one is the front one. Again, I know you haven't completed the whole thing. Let me just show you a couple of examples of the ways in which students represented their projects. They created web pages. They described what they did. In particular, each student had to do something, some sort of a project, collect evidence or organize things or provide some service to the group. And in each case, they write about the connections. How is this project I did connected to the academic coursework? So in the same way that I was claiming earlier that trying to explain quantum mechanics to your uncle could possibly energize your investigation of physics, she found that when students were trying to create these projects, it caused them to make deeper connections to the philosophies they were reading. And it wasn't they saw the two, as disconnected, and the students generated the connections. It wasn't the professor lecturing saying, this idea helps you here. It emerged from the student's experience. This is a student who did her work at a women's transitional care service, which is a great euphemism, women who are battered. And her analysis over here of power and control, very sophisticated actually. I don't know if you follow this area of pathology, but many women who are in domestically violent relationships do not leave, and it's a puzzlement for all. They make observations. It is a richer project than any professor would think to ask students to do without that community engagement. And as Anne says in her essay, their connection to it is deeper than it would be if they just read about it. Again, the notion of connections, and then a wide range of settings. This is a multicultural community center, and so much of this person's writing was about identity. Now, identity is both a cultural kind of hot button, but it's also important in gender. And again, the students were encouraged to use this not just to be a do-gooder, not just to be out there in the community, but to make it the reason to study the philosophy. So, can you imagine some meaningful contacts? I don't know how possible this is in your context. I live and work in a relatively small town, so there are people who can make connections with community settings. I know faculty members in a larger city, Kansas City, who do this quite a bit. But you could think about whether there is something like this. Our engineering students at KU always engage in a semester-long internship or co-op. Now, I call that the same as this stuff. Some people think it's just pre-professional training. It's engaging a meaningful community that gives you real problems that cause you to take your studies more seriously, which has the same function. Or is there a medium of expression? I'm particularly keen on this idea, is there an audience other than you that students need to connect to? And again, many of those students in Anne's class used those products to show to their family and their friends. How many people do you know take a paper written on critical literary studies and show it to their parents? It just doesn't happen. Or in psychology, you can write any paper you want on, the history of discrimination learning, in mammals, and nobody wants to read that. Probably not even the professor. But it's what we do. So I think that's what this invites, is to think about those kinds of, what are the natural organic forms of communication, community, and representation that our current students bring to us, and inviting them to use them, not because it is a substitute in a way for the term paper, but because it motivates them to do the work that we want them to do that normally we motivate by saying you have to write a paper. So take a minute or two to chat with the person next to you about whether this particular genre, community engagement, could be useful to you. Okay, if I could suggest that this is a pretty good time for us to take our second break. And when we come back, we'll do two things. I will do a little telling. I will describe a few things sort of quickly. And then I'm going to ask you to start writing, to write down a specific plan for yourself. So in the last third, I'll sort of synthesize some of this stuff, and then you'll be making a plan for you to take away. And then I'll ask you to share a short version of that with me so that I can harvest some of that to talk about on Friday. All right? So let's reconvene again in about 10 minutes. This is the way we've all, well, I throughout most of my career had this vision of what a professor does. A professor synthesizes knowledge, makes it clear, and shares it with someone else. So I've done the work of taking all the things I know, making sense out of it, and turning it into a narrative, which is like an adult bird feeding a baby bird. That's just so yesterday. Relatively few people, it turns out, when you look at data, learn best that way. That something about the construction or synthesizing of it is critical to a deeper understanding. I have data which I haven't included in today's session, where I found that when I simply did the synthesis for the students, they learned to mimic my synthesis without really understanding it. And so I've switched more to problems, both as the way of learning and as the way of measuring. As was suggested, about what's the place of the lecture in the future, I think many people are starting to move the transfer of information outside of class time. And using the face-to-face time to do the things that are more personal, more constructive, more interactive. There are many kinds of learning, and I don't wish to give privilege to any one of them. There's the basic knowledge, what Shada called the stuff. You can't think critically if you don't know anything. So you have to know the phenomena of your field. There are skills, things like communication, collaboration, problem solving, research skills, evaluation skills. And then there's also understanding, which is partially those skills, but it's partially, seeing the big picture, being able to recognize connections among disparate areas, recognizing similarities and differences, and in particular, being able to use ideas in a way you weren't taught. So I can teach you, okay, here's how you use this equation to solve this particular problem. But if you can recognize that that equation is also applicable in a situation I didn't teach, then you really understand that equation. So all of these are important. And education has to have all these. But which of them, need interaction, and which of them are things you can do pretty much on your own? I mean, if you really read text, you learn a lot. So knowledge, the foundation of it all, is often being moved online into adaptive tutorials, where basically it's like an on-computer textbook where students are presented information, they're given opportunities to test their own understanding, they're given problems to do that help them grow in their understanding, and it's all individualized, it's mastery-based, it's adaptive because every person goes through in a different path. And there's plenty of data showing that students who do that kind of knowledge acquisition learn it better than students who listen to one of us tell them orally. Skills, you can do some of that modeling online, but I think skills are the sort of thing that are well developed in live interaction. And then understanding, the rich posing of new problems and discussing of them may be the sort of thing that's best done in a full interactive mode. I ask my colleagues the question, based on what you're doing, why are you live in a classroom with students? If all you're doing is what an adaptive tutorial program can do, you're not using that time well. Use the face-to-face time to do things you can't do by having them read or engage with a computer. And I think, when people ask me what's the next 20 years of teaching, it's going to be being smart about knowing how much of what we do is online with people learning knowledge and how much is what we do face-to-face, and using those two well. Here's just another way of representing that. You've got, direct instruction is where you tell people stuff. Inductive learning is where the students discover it. In class, you can do a lot of that. Direct instruction in class would be lecture or demonstrations. I see people moving it more to out of class, getting people to do real reading. And then working problems, finding new cases, and experiential learning are also well done outside of class. So this is just a framework for thinking about it. These are not chipped in gold. I actually developed this little grid to work with my colleagues in the School of Pharmacy, who have some very high-tech classrooms, and they were using them mostly to still lecture. and not engaging students. So I tried to ask them, why are you live? Why is that important? That phrase I used earlier, there is a time for telling. When the audience already knows a lot, a lecture is a fabulous way to communicate efficiently synthesized understanding and new ideas. Right? So I have the confidence that I'm in a room filled with professionals. You have all thought deeply about your own teaching, and so I can, for 10 or 15 minutes, say stuff, and you're not just trying, what did he say, and writing it down. You're questioning it. You're comparing it to your own experience. You've got something to bring to it. So we are having 20 individual conversations, but I just don't hear what you're thinking. That's when lecture is good. When it's first exposure, the data show it's not the best way to learn. Then what you want are adaptive tutorials or a good system for reading good text. So the support for lecture is you provide a good foundation. When the students can control what they view, they learn better. Wonderful example from a medical school in Missouri in which students who were from underprepared backgrounds were failing the medical boards, even though they had been part of the university curriculum. When they made one innovation, that failure rate disappeared. And that was the students had access to the lectures on videotape, and they could stop and pause them, watch in groups, go back and listen to another minute. Just that tiny little bit of turning it into a more of a controlled information flow made all the difference. And recall Lender Calder's little week. On Friday he talked. Monday and Wednesday he said nothing. He wandered the room. And when he talked, they were ready to listen just from 2 days of working on the problem themselves. So it doesn't have to be that you can't lecture until someone's a senior. I'm quite taken with this thing. In the US, it's called studio physics. It's like a lot of things. I had a wonderful, wonderful afternoon yesterday out at the Duke NUS Medical School program. A very sophisticated group of leaders redesigning a curriculum in a way that's very similar to this. It basically says, let's use hands-on development, team work to solve problems. It's problem solving is the key to this. And instead of having it a 50-minute lecture, there are 2-hour blocks of time. The room looks like this. You've got all these tables, and here's the teacher's center in the middle, which looks like this. Each table has laptop computers and materials, and this group of 8 students are solving problems. They spend those 2 hours solving problems. The professor never lectures. The professor and whatever TAs are available wander the room as consultants. You got a question? I won't give you the answer, but I'll help you think through what you need to look up. They've got the internet. They can go search anything they want. And they are spending those 2 hours solving problems and teaching each other. There are homework assignments, there's reading. It's not like they're inventing physics. But they're not listening to someone tell them the answers or demonstrate equations on the board. Astonishingly, when they compared this with students who took the regular lecture course using the regular exams from the lecture course, not a special dumbed-down studio physics exam, the overall failure rate in the studio decreased by over 60%. For women, the failure rate decreased by 75%. I don't know what it's like in Singapore. In the United States, there is a, quote, gender gap, which certain university presidents claim is because women have different brains. You teach studio physics, it disappears. It's not that women can't learn physics. It's that for whatever reason, typical American women don't want to listen to a physics professor talk for 50 minutes. Now, whether that's pathology or insight, we could debate. The same would be true of a psychology professor. Right? And the fact that's astonished me is this is not dumbing it down. When they looked at the comparison of lecture versus studio physics, the students who showed the biggest improvement were the top 1/3 of engineering students at MIT. The better the students, the more they gain from doing problem-based team learning. And it's all on these regular exams. They're not learning some skills that nobody cares about. They're learning the skills that engineering faculty and physics faculty have cared about for decades. How do we resolve the tension that you raised between lecture and discovery? It does mean less coverage. In that course that I described, I cover only 60% of what I covered in that course 10 years ago. I believe I'm covering it much better. My students do much more writing. They write in more sophisticated ways. They are engaged with their peers as an audience. But there are 2 or 3 topics I've left out. Because for me to do it this way, I cannot in one semester cover the same number of topics. Now, I'm guessing if I could see the students 5 years later, that even though I covered more in the old days, they'd forgotten more. Whereas the stuff I'm covering now, I know the students are retaining because they've just learned it in a different way. So sort of comments on this general idea of not presenting the conclusions for students, but engaging them in constructive, helpful, supported, scaffolded ways of solving problems so that they learn it. And again, I think it taps into their strengths. I don't think, somebody put up here attention span. Whatever the attention span was of the typical undergraduate 50 years ago, it's less now. How much less we could debate. But it's definitely less. And so we could fight that. We could demand that the registrar get us better students who can sit quietly for longer, but that would run into problems with our budgets. I want to quickly describe a couple of ways I'm using technology, not fancy stuff like studio physics, but just off-the-shelf things that come as part of our course management system. A collaborative writing tool, a poster tool where students post their own reflections. I use a lot of activities, assignments that are intended to help people learn, not intended to help me discover how much they know. In EduBabble, these are called Formative Assessments. They are learning how well they've learned rather than I'm testing them for high stakes. The use of that is very important. And my evaluation in the end is with traditional exams and interviews. So one thing I do is I give the students an exam question from a prior year, and then several answers written by actual students, always with their permission. It's like organ donation. Would you donate your bad answers to the pool so people can learn from them? I ask the students to comment. These are in groups of, say, 5 or 6 people in a learning team, which answer they think is the best. Because I have a good one, a bad one, and a medium one. I never tell them what I think. Their job is to use their understanding among themselves to figure out what's best. When I added this, I got a huge bump up in scores on the exams. It was astonishing. Even though the questions are not the same as the ones they're going to see on the exam, the practice of grading other students and talking about it turned out to be a great way to teach understanding. I asked them to make reflective postings. This gets at what educationists call metacognition. What do they think about their own learning? How does their own learning relate to their own lives? This is stuff I used to snicker at 10 years. I mean, literally, I'm not a nice person all the time. When I see a fad, I go, oh God, another one of those. But one, I forget why, but I tried it one year. Amazing how having students think about, not just repeating what's going to be on the test, but how does what you learned connect to your life? How does what you learn about this now compared to how you felt about it when the semester started? Very, very powerful. And again, it's easy to use. There are plenty of tools that allow you to do this. I use one that came from Carnegie. I have them do collaborative writing assignments. This is, the jargony term is a wiki, which I learned recently comes from a Hawaiian term, wiki, which means quick. What this has to do with quick, I have no idea. In teams of 5 or 6 people, they're given an assignment, they do research, they construct an account. At first I was using these as a graded assignment. I have now made a transition into considering this the construction of a shared repository. So they construct this body of knowledge. It's in its own way a little like what Shada did, except less large, less formal, and not all done at once. This is something they do 3 times during the semester. The nice thing about it is I can see what everybody contributed, so if I want to see individual work, I can do that. I have a 20-minute conversation at the end of the semester. I set aside a 2-week period where each of the 40 students makes an appointment with me, and they come in and we talk. I have a set of standard questions. I videotape it, and then I score it. Just very low stakes for them. They get 80% just for showing up. All right? I differentiate from there to 100 depending on how good their answers, how complete their comments are. But it's it's weird stuff like when is psychology a science and when is it not? What are the characteristics of what's done in a scientific community? In what ways does psychology not operate as a scientific community? I mean, this is the sort of question I give them. It's sort of the bigger level understandings that I hope my course produces. I have them read, and now I have them actually look at a video on global warming. And then I ask them to use the ideas we've talked about in self-control to analyze it. So we never connected those two things. We never talk about global warming in class. When they come to the interview, they have to use what we did talk about in class to talk about global warming. This is the kind of, it's called a cognitive apprenticeship rubric because as an apprentice you have a novice beginning. Over here would be truly novice. You start to have an understanding, a better understanding, and then advanced. And I describe in text the quality of somebody who's at each level of development on each of the topics in the interview. This is the sort of thing I was describing to you at the break about how I represent this development. It's explicitly developmental. It was my hope that everybody was up here. Here's another one. I think at least one of these is in the handout. Good time for me to mention all of these slides. You may have noticed the handout is both incomplete and occasionally inaccurate because I've changed the slides. I've given the entire slide package to Kritika, and it will be available if you wanted to get stuff like this, or my email is there and I'd be happy to send you any of these things. In the oral exam, when I asked them about self-control, before I added all these off-the-shelf technology things, this was a typical distribution that I would get just on this one question. When I added those things in, the zeros disappeared and most of the mid-range disappeared, and I got a huge shift to the right. That having people write with each other, having people reflect, having them use their understanding to grade other people's work, not grade literally, but evaluate, had a huge effect on their ability to evaluate their own work. When I took all of the components, there are 5 components of the interview, and I summed them up to a total grade, before I added these things, I had nobody in the top level, and I had a third of the class. That's 3 out of 20 points on average for each of the 5 components. I like to refer to those students as clueless. I hate to say that, but okay. When we added in this stuff, clueless disappears. It's gone. And the biggest increase was in this range, but each of these 3 levels got more students. This was relatively little work for me. I actually gave them more work to do. Okay, now you have to do these things online. And they learned. It was, again, I didn't expect this. I was very skeptical that this kind of just having people write more, reflect more, would help. But it does. I want to show you one last thing before we focus on what you have taken away. Actually, given the time, I'll just skip that. It's not hypercritical. It's fun and interesting. We can go back to it if there's time. here's what I'd like you to do. You know, we've thrown a bunch of ideas out here. You've read some, you've talked to your partner about your course. I want you to now, you know, think carefully about one thing that you would really think you could do the next time you teach the course you've been thinking about. The next time that module is being prepared, what's some way you can take advantage of our current students' assets or avoid some of their liabilities that you think you could really do? So take a few moments, think about it, write something out, and then here's what I'd like to ask is if, make sure you have a second or a piece of paper if you don't have a clean one. We have more here. I'd like you to write out and give it to me, and I'm going to read them, because what I'd like to do is include a few of them in my talk on Friday. In part to make the point that this isn't, you don't have to be somebody who gives up a research career or only teaches one course a year to be able to do this. What's something that's doable and reasonable within your life that you could consider doing? That's what I'd like to share. So write for a few minutes, and then we'll hear some of your examples. I know some of you are still writing. I wanted to at least initiate a period of your questions, your observations. If you wanted to share the example you've just written, that would be fun. You've raised a number of good alternative views as we've gone along. That's how I know you were not just passively writing down everything I said, which would be good. This, by the way, is a picture of the heart of the University of Kansas campus. There's a big park in the middle of the campus. We're on a ridge around it. That's at a good time of year. It's not always that pretty. Sir.
Comment about the visit might be useful as well. You may teach a different lessons and then you're supposed to apply what you've done, observe in the visit and see what you can take away.
Yeah, which kind of visits do you think would be most useful?
Well, it really depends on the topic you're teaching. Yeah, so if you're, say for example, if you're teaching something related to the industry, and then you want to teach them how to, for example, manage production and so forth. What are principles you can glean from the visit itself?
Yeah. And it's interesting, a lot of times in the classes that I took, many times that sort of visit would come at the end of the class. Because the professor believed, I have to prepare you to be able to recognize what you're going to see. One argument that could be made is some of those visits should come early. When you ask students to form their own observations, what do you see? Does it look efficient? Does it look effective? What would you need to know to decide if this was an effective way to run that business or to manage that resource? So, yeah. The whole idea behind a lab in a science course is there's this hands-on experience. There are two things I'll say about some of the labs at my university in biology and chemistry. First, silliest, there's no timing connection between the lab and the lecture. Right? The person who teaches the lab is not the person who teaches the lecture, and there is no ability of the person teaching the lecture to get the lab professor to change the order so that it matches the class. I am bewildered at this. It's been that way for the 10 years I've been there, and I have been unable to change it. Not only that, the students can take the lab without the lecture or the lecture without the lab. There are historical reasons for this. Who knows? Second, the labs are all what would be called cookbook. Everybody does the same thing. There are steps. If you follow the steps, everybody gets the same answer. There's a right answer. Anybody who knows science knows that's not how science works. I mean, if you're doing interesting science, you don't know the answer when you start. 3 people could do the same experiment and get slightly different or maybe wildly different answers. And the essence of science is figuring out how to frame a question, how to observe something and make sense of the observation. Not, can I match what the TA says my answer is supposed to be? So if you imagine inductive learning, I mean, what could be more productive than having the students all did their independent inquiry lab, then they get together and compare results. Then their job is to figure out, why did you get different results than I did? That's where the real learning would take place. Not, can I follow the TA's instructions and get the same outcome? And that's another kind of a visit.
Yeah, you started with knowing who our students are. What do you do to get to know the students? Whether they're repeat types or non-repeat types? What do you do?
I'm very minimalist on that. I kind of, at one level, traffic in the stereotypes. That is, I pay attention to what everybody says about students, and I also give a sort of a survey. Each student fills out a sheet second day of class in which they tell me whether they like speaking in class or not. They tell me how often they've used various technology tools. They tell me whether they like working in groups. They tell me whether they like sharing writing. And I use that information when I construct my learning teams so that I don't have a team that has nobody who likes presenting or nobody who likes building a wiki. So I use it just to balance them. I have a colleague in management who gives a personality test, basically, and so that he can balance his teams. Now, he has more faith in that test than I do. But people do various ways. I mean, I do try to have the students tell me about themselves, but I use it mostly to balance the teams so that there's no team that is absent an asset. My students and I just decided last week that what we're going to do is we're going to ask people an additional question. In a typical week, how many classes do you skip? Or actually, I think we're going to say, how many classes do you miss for whatever reason? You know, because we found a couple times if there's a team that has 2 or 3 of those people who are low attenders, that hurts the team. Now, one strategy is you put them all on one team and they all fail, and who cares? I'm cold and heartless like that some of the time. More, we try to spread that out so that it would be a matter of contagion, that the people who are regular attenders would bring the others along.
So if I find that some parts of the class like to group work and some parts like to work alone, would you suggest that my assignments be a hybrid of individual papers? In other words, for those who like to work alone, they can submit individual final papers. For those who like to work in groups, they do group projects. Is that sort of hybrid approach recommended, or should I just sort of strike a compromise and say the majority of this kind, and therefore I'm going to go group work?
Well, I'm happy to have people be as customizable as they're willing to with students. You know, you could have every student make his or her own project, and you know, you would give them each an individual evaluation. And I think that's excellent teaching. It's harder for me as a teacher to have to work with so many students individually as they structure their assignment and then figure out how to evaluate it in some fair and equitable way. But I have no objection to that. I mean, that's what graduate education is.
But students object sometimes because they feel that they're being disadvantaged. On the one hand, they choose a certain style and they're happy that you're giving it to them, whether it's individual work or group work. But then they would quibble about how that group is advantaged in these ways, that there's no parity in the assignment grade.
I'm of 2 minds on that, on group work. When our the career people bring in people from businesses to hire students, and as part of that they ask them, what do you think of KU students? What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? And one of the weaknesses they always report is they do not work well in teams. So many of us have said we're going to build teamwork into our classes because it's a relevant skill. It's one of those skills that a graduate of a university should have. So I do ask people to work in teams at some point. On the other hand, I have stopped pretty much evaluating teamwork. Partially, a lot of students don't like, they just don't like it for various reasons. So I now use teams to build up resources, and then each student uses the resources in an individual project. Okay? So they get the experience of contributing to something that everybody uses, but what they make of it is still individual. So they get both experiences. I would not object if somebody wanted to give the students a choice. You can participate in a team that'll build the repository and then write your own paper, or you can just write your own paper. Myself, I'm not ready to have everybody write an entirely different project. I can't do that.
I did an ed psych exam once where the professor actually was thinking about that. We got an individual and a group score, and we had like a single table and 3 tables behind. We just rotated around, so a quarter of the answers were your own, and 3. So you end up a score out of 25 for your individual, and a score out of 75 for the group. And the group had to communicate with each other on the answer to those questions. So you end up getting both scores, like some contribution individual and group.
And I actually like a model in which people learn a responsibility for community. You know, part of your job is to help everybody else do well. That's pretty un-American, and so it doesn't fly very well among our students who are not like faculty. They're typical Americans, and so. But I like that idea. But it's where you step across educational values into social values, and. You know, I could see making the case. If I did it, I would put it in the syllabus and in the schedule, so nobody's surprised when they get to class. Then, you don't like this, don't take the course. I don't care.
What do you mean by asking students to build up a repository?
Yeah, so using this collaborative writing tool, one of the topics that I asked them to write about is single-sex schools, something Kritika and I were talking about the other day. And there's a lot of research, and there are a lot of different ideas. So each person will go find some kinds of writing and post it in this public space, public to the 5 or 6 on the learning team. And then they'll reflect on it. They'll say, well, I think this means this, or I think we need to look at that. And all that is available to the whole group. Then each person reads that, including the articles and the summaries that other people did, and then writes their own paper. So they have to coordinate themselves to create the knowledge base. Again, it's a little like what Shada did, except on a much smaller scale. And they do that collaboratively as a team. But then individually, they have to make sense of it. Yeah. Right. Again, it's a value question, and I'm agnostic on it. I understand competition, and I don't think it's all bad. I would just say to people, you know, in many places in life, you will be rewarded if you can help others. And so in this class, one of the things you'll do will be to build up information that others will benefit from. And that's okay. Nobody's going to get an A in the class because other people did all the work. So there's still room for differentiation. But you know, it's a value assertion that there's a time and a place to help others and to contribute to the common good. And this class is one of those. And you don't have to come away thinking it's good, but that's what we're doing here. It's one of the skills we're building. It's a keen observation, though. It would, in our country, the most competitive undergraduates are pre-medicine because the medical profession keeps the number of slots in schools very low to keep their salaries high. And so the competition is fierce, and it is a zero-sum game. So if you let other people do better in biology than you do, it hurts you. And I don't think that's a kind of a toxic environment, but I appreciate that it exists. I don't deny it. The clock on the wall says we have run out of time. I'd like to thank you. I hope your notes to yourself are useful. And if I could have if you're willing, I'd love to have your sheet so that I can read what you were thinking of doing. If you included your name, I would happily mention it if I describe your work on Friday.